All right, what's going on, guys? My name is Hussien Jabai of Jabai Performance. I'm here with James Thayer, and today we're going to be talking about fitness program breakdown. We're kind of highlighting how you would break down movements or break down a fitness program for tactical personnel. James, if you could kind of go over just a brief background, a little bit about yourself, and then we'll power through these slides.
Yeah, so as Hussein said, I'm James Thayer. I'm the Assistant Director of Fitness and Wellness at Washburn University in Kansas. And so my background, I have a master's in health, physical education, recreation, and undergrad bachelor in human health performance. And I'm a certified personal trainer and a master trainer with ACE Fitness.
All right. So we're gonna, before we can go into specifically what, I guess, what exercises we're using or breaking down the movements, we need to kind of consider the factors that are going to affect, the way we program our physical fitness, the way our schedule is set up in regards to our work is going to dictate kind of how we adjust to our training. So whether you're law enforcement, running 12s where you're not able to work out on shift. And then, if you say you work 4 days on and then you rest for 3 days, well, the 4 days that you actually work, you might be working 12-hour shifts. And then, if in an ideal world, if you're trying to get 8 hours of sleep, then how is that going to contradict how we're adjusting our training schedule? But then with firefighters, how with running a 24 or 48-hour shift, even though we're able to work out, on the clock or at the fire station, how we can manipulate our training to be more effective and efficient, while we're at the station or the days we're not at the station, how we can train differently or implement different things based off of different factors, such as equipment or facility access. If we have a gym that we can go to, if we have equipment at the house that we can use. And then on top of specifically looking at job related factors, stress, what stress are we getting from our job that's going to dictate kind of the intensity of our training. Looking at job description, whether you work at a desk, whether you drive the engine, whether you're part of the TAC team, different job descriptions means different levels of physical fitness, different ways of implementing training to have a different level of conditioning. Now, we could try and implement and try and get everyone to be at the physical fitness standard of a GI Joe or an ideal world soldier, but there are different job descriptions. Sometimes we do need to just focus on health and mobility for someone who's sitting at the desk all the time, or for someone that's on the TAC team or military personnel, implementing more on the strength and conditioning and a higher level of that aspect for that job description. Another factor is annual testing. What does your qualifications, what do your qualifications look like? What level do you need to meet for your job? And then where do you need to improve? If you're not getting to that level, well, that's going to affect your programming. You're going to have to program to pass those tests. And then if you already pass those, well, programming is just for the perspective of progression. How do we maintain health while being at a higher level? But then how do we progress, from there? How can we maintain, but also, push our boundaries? Another factor is going to be weather. If you're outside and, say it's summer in Texas, this is going to affect, the kind of intensity that you're training outside. You're going to have to consider hydration and stuff when you're out in the heat, and different factors with the cold. And then when looking at dry versus rainy, when it's rainy and storming outside, you may or may not be able to use different equipment that slide or drag, if you don't have parking lot, if it's in the grass or in the mud. Programming might differ based off your environment. And then another factor listed is like supplementation and prescribed medication, whether it's like, different blood or lipid controlling medication or things that are prescribed from a doctor can affect the intensity you're training at, the workload you're training at. James, if you have any
Yeah.
input, I guess, on these factors.
Yeah, and so something to consider that we'll talk through with this presentation is any programming that you're doing is meant to support and complement your job and the other aspects of your life. That this training is meant to work around those, not the opposite way around where we're trying to jam these other things into a training schedule. We want training to complement what you're doing on the job, what you're doing outside of work, because that's the whole purpose, is trying to build a capacity to transfer it into work to make you more efficient and more effective with your job, but also help manage stress, help with sleep, help you be able to function more regularly and be more efficiently whenever you are on call or you're put to action with the duties and requirements of your job. So with that, make sure that you're considering in this that any programming that you're doing is supposed to complement and have a positive impact on the job itself. That the way this is set up, it's meant to work around the schedule and assist with that.
Awesome. Yeah, and like you said, it's to help you within your job, but also your day-to-day life. You don't want something that's I guess programmed out for your job, but it's going to affect. I mean, it's going to affect your day-to-day. You could probably do a very high intensity training and try to get very fast progression, but if you're walking around at home with lower back pain and stuff from the training from your job, it's going to be counterproductive, and that is also going to correlate to the job setting. Moving on to after looking at, I guess, the factors behind why you choose certain kinds of intensity, certain kinds of programming, we're gonna kind of glance at how we, I guess, categorize movements, categorize exercise selection, and I put down a few or like the main ones. I guess there for a general population, there might be 6 or 7 of these in regards to things we kind of look for in exercise training, such as the press, the row, like a hinge, step up, squat, and maybe a jump. That I would say an average person, can implement it, and it's awesome to implement it, but it's not one of those things emphasized or addressed highly in general population. But when looking in regards to tactical personnel, we're going to add the jump and the bound, the drag, the carry, and then transition. And the reason behind the drag and carry is specifically for in the field, whether you're having to drag or carry equipment, personnel that have fallen in the field, debris. I mean, there's different factors that you're going to encounter while you're on the job, and you should train for things that you may or may not encounter. And so adding these in as staples for your training are going to prepare you for those moments. And a huge one, you may or may not see that it may not be addressed, or it is selected, I guess, as a category where it needs to be like a checklist type thing when looking at building your fitness program, is transition. And this is, specifically you see from the ground to your feet. So whether it's Turkish get-ups and vice versa, doing burpees and different things where you're transitioning, because at times, in the field, you might be crawling and have to stand up, or fall and have to and stand back up, or vice versa. You're standing and you have to go, to your hands and knees. And so implementing and addressing these things, like I said, within your training is going to prepare you for in the field for situations you may or may not encounter.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to that, so with all of these movements, there's a wide variety of exercises that fit into these. They're not defined by 1 or 2 exercises. There's a whole list and different directionals that we can consider. So like for the press, it can be a horizontal press like a bench press, or a vertical press like a overhead press or a push press. So there's other considerations in how we move just naturally through our body. So what we're trying to do with the movement breakdown is make sure that we're covering all of these that you might experience in a rescue situation or a life and death situation, doing it in a lower stress environment and trying to reinforce those movement capacities and movement efficiencies. So whenever you are in the moment, and when you are having to recruit these movement patterns, that you've reinforced them and made them more efficient. So you're not having to go through and do the checklists that you might do during training in those situations, because you don't have time and you're not going to be able to go through and break down, okay, do I have my rib cage stacked under my pelvis? Am I making sure? We want to make sure that you're recruiting that just naturally and being able to do that autonomously without having to think back through. And so with all of these, like Hussien said, the point of it is to reinforce that resiliency in the movement to transfer into whenever it's a demand and whenever it's a need, because it comes down to it that the less efficient you are in these movements, whenever it's call to action, it's going to cost you more energy. It's going to cost you more oxygen. And that could be the difference between a life and death situation or your ability to be able to respond. And so building up work capacities and becoming efficient in all these movements that we'll go through later transfers well into what you'll do in the line of work.
Exactly, and I kind of address these kind of like a checklist of categories to fill within your training. Every session doesn't have to have every single one of these. You want to look at it in a weekly setting, in a 2-week setting, in a training cycle, and see where these balance. And I do like having these set up in this format in regards to categories, because you can address how many movements you do per category. So if you're doing a ton of press work, and you may not realize it at first, you might have your upper body, lower body days, you might have your full body days. Personally, for tactical personnel, I truly believe your athletes train like athletes, full body movements, right? Or full body training. That may or may not be the case for each individual. Sometimes, like I said, upper body, lower body, legs, push, pull, there's different training splits that people do. But if you still use these categories to address in a weekly setting, you might find out you're doing 10 pressing movements and 3 rowing movements. And so now, just looking at it from a checklist, tally mark kind of perspective, you can see the imbalances just based off of the movements you're doing. It might be able to even go hand in hand, and you will see, like I said, if you see 10 pressing movements and 2 or 3 rowing movements, you're going to see it on a muscular imbalance, on a movement pattern imbalance perspective. But sometimes you don't really see that or understand that till you actually see it on paper, or if you have someone analyze, videotape and analyze your movement and break it down for you. Sometimes it's harder to have that perspective of seeing yourself do the movements and understand that imbalance. And so if you just use a tally or a checklist, you can see that maybe you're doing more sides or portions of the body than others, more movements than others. And so this is a way to kind of keep yourself in check when programming things out for yourself or for your department. Moving on, so going along with that perspective of categories and how to go about programming things out, there usually we see it in 2 different, I guess, perspectives or approaches to those movements. Like, say, the 2 are going to be bilateral and unilateral. Now, this can be for upper body, it can be for lower body. Basically, with one, you're using both limbs at the same time, doing the same task, and then the other one, they're individual. You're working them separate. And a lot of times in the tactical world, you do want to do a lot of unilateral training, because that's what you're going to be doing in a day-to-day setting. Whether you're walking, dragging, carrying, climbing upstairs, using a ladder, everything is working. Even though you're working as a whole, like your entire body is functioning in unison, each thing is going to be performing its own workload individually, doing its own task at different times. And so doing unilateral training, whether it's different kinds of lunges or single arm work or single leg work or whatever it might be, I feel like that's going to carry over more in the tactical world perspective. But keep in mind, don't neglect bilateral training, different squat variations, pressing variations, deadlift variations, whatever it might be, because that can build a solid foundation for strength, for movement, building your movement patterns from that perspective. So you shouldn't neglect either, but definitely make sure that you're addressing both within your training program.
Absolutely. And to kind of add to that, with bilateral movements, it gives us an ability, even though they're static in their position on the ground, it gives us ability to load to a greater degree. So we're able to overload and progress some of those movements that, while the movement itself might not transfer directly over to your line of work, but we can carry over strength and reinforce that will assist and aid to some of the unilateral movements that you'll see direct carryover from.
Exactly. And also looking at, from the two different, I guess, approaches in regards to exercise selection, understand that just because you're going to get very strong or stronger or progress within unilateral training does not mean your bilateral lifts are going to go up a ton just because your unilateral training is. They do have their carryover in regards to, if you train your legs individually and get them stronger by themselves, you will see more stability and individual strength within bilateral training, but does not mean if you do one, it's going to directly carry over to the other one. Now looking at, I guess, different functions when looking at exercise selection, and it's different ways, different ways to subconsciously look at what you're doing within a movement, how you're breaking down the movement, what the function or the task is within that movement. And the three main ones, or the three to address, is going to be rotation, anti-rotation, and contraction. And when we look at rotation, it doesn't have to be something pinpointing a specific muscle. Like you'll see whether it's the quadruped thoracic spine rotation, where you directly look at the spine and you're like, okay, the torso is twisting, the thoracic spine is rotating, and so you're seeing a direct rotational component in a segment of the movement. This could be something like a landmine press, where your shoulder, your arms are doing something, but you still have that rotational aspect to it, to where you are incorporating your core within a movement. That could be addressing, upper body strength and shoulder strength, but you're getting that rotational component, and therefore you're addressing rotational health, spine health, which is going to go a long way with preventing injury or managing injury within your department. And then looking at the anti-rotation aspect, this is going to be more of the isometric. You're able to withstand tension, withstand force, whether it's weight, whether it's gravity. You're able to basically stabilize or maintain form while doing a movement. And this could be anything from doing, lawnmower rows and presses, where you're engaging your core, or different kinds of carries and different movements, different planks, bird dogs, different, I guess in those perspectives, you're using gravity, like bird dogs and planks, you're resisting gravity, right? But looking at suitcase carries, you're resisting the tension of the weight on one side or the other, or on both sides. You're having to stabilize your core within a movement. And then looking at contraction, this is your pretty standard one. If you're doing, a push-up, you're contracting, at the chest and your triceps and stuff. This is more, you're going to see it with flexion and extension, adduction and abduction type movements. But these three kind of give you a deeper perspective of when you're looking at exercise selection, still considering, am I doing, all anti-rotation? Am I making sure I'm standing still and stabilizing for every single exercise and not getting any rotation? And how is that going to affect me? How do I need to, and why do I need to, and should I start implementing rotational exercises? And obviously the answer is yes, but you need to use this to kind of analyze how you're actually, what your program looks like now, and how you can make adaptations and adjustments to get kind of components from each category.
Yeah, and these really build on the bilateral and unilateral. So whenever you're starting to evaluate your program, like Hussien said, you'll have this checkbox, or you can start writing down and seeing where you might be giving greater focus to, and where it might be lacking that you need to readdress and add to. So if we're looking at all of these, they fit into bilateral and unilateral. It just might be the intention behind them might be different. Oftentimes with bilateral movements, we don't want rotation. Depending on how static that position is. So like if we're going through a squatting pattern or a back bar or a barbell back squat, we don't want to rotate as we're doing that. We want to stay very, we want to focus on anti-rotation. Whereas rotating through, it's important to integrate that into your programming as well. It's not something that we want to neglect, because we can look at some of the movements like having to utilize an axe to chop down a door, something like that, that requires a lot of resiliency in being able to rotate that to produce force through that tool. We've probably all know a story of somebody that made a slight movement reaching across for something and threw out their back. It's because they didn't have efficiency in that rotation. So this is something that we're trying to avoid, to make sure that we're building a foundation on that that's going to transfer into the work. And then with anti-rotation, we're wanting to go and make sure that we have the ability to resist forces that are acting upon the body. So with that, having that stability of anti-rotation, part of it is about force transference, that if we're going through like gait cycle or walking patterns and needing to produce force from our lower body to our upper body, if we're not stabilizing in that, if we're rotating when we shouldn't, we're going to have energy leakage. We're not going to be as smooth or be able to produce as much force for some of those movements or those exercises. So we want to make sure that we're addressing that to be efficient in it. And we have a multitude of ways, loaded and unloaded, going against gravity, going against weights, and then considerations for contraction, that we can look at contraction as shortening of the muscle, but can also look at the position that it's being shortened in. So looking at a fully lengthened muscle, a mid-range, or a fully shortened. So with the fully lengthened and the fully shortened, that those are weak points and they're going to create more stress in our program. So if we're going through and doing bicep curls with our arm fully extended to bringing it to our chest, we just need to be mindful and considerate that that's putting a lot of force and stress through that joint. So if we're doing that there, we might need to consider maybe a mid-range movement later on in the week. And so whenever we start to take these different considerations of bilateral, unilateral rotation, anti-rotation, and the different degrees of contraction, we can build it out through the week, and we can look at the different days that we have programmed in and make sure that we're building a balance with that that's complementing our work schedule.
What was that? What was that quote? You're only strong in the range of motion you train in.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you're only strong in the range of motion you train in. Because going back to like people that talk about like throwing out their back, they're not strong in that range of motion because they haven't built a work capacity, or they haven't operated in that rotational pattern. So whenever too much force is applied through, we start to see injury. And the whole point of having programs to help support your job function in life is to minimize the risk of injury the best we can, because at the end of the day, if you start building injury, you're not able to work, and it doesn't it makes you less efficient at your job if you're trying to work through pain. So we're trying to make sure that we're minimizing that the best we can, with greater considerations to how we're programming.
Exactly. And when considering developing your fitness program, take a moment to kind of analyze your job, think of the movements you're doing in the field, and then start kind of breaking down different, what movements can I do based off of some of the things we've brought up. You know, what movements can I implement that are going to transfer or have some kind of similarities in movement patterns. Therefore, you know, like we just talked about, you need to have done the movement before for it to seem familiar, for it to be more efficient for your body, for you to be stronger in that movement. So you're trying to design this program to replicate those movements. Therefore, when you're in the field, you're not getting those injuries. And then, same thing as day-to-day life. And then I think I think this is our last, I guess, breakdown as far as movement patterns go is open chain and closed chain. And you're not going to really, or most individuals are not going to, I guess, think of this in regards to open chain and closed chain. We just think of, different variations of exercise. But if you actually take a moment to kind of, I guess, understand the difference between the two, with open chain being that your hand and foot, or your hands and feet are free to move. So think of it as a grid, and your hands or your feet, say your hands are dots on a grid, and if they move, those dots will move, right? So it's being displaced throughout wherever it is within the universe. Your hands are being displaced. There's some kind of distance factor to your hands where your hands move to. And therefore, it's going to be an open chain movement. And this could be a bench press, a chest fly, and then looking at from the feet perspective, a leg press, leg curl, leg extension. These points of contact, or what's moving the weight, is actually there's some kind of displacement factor, movement factor to them. And then a closed chain, where those segments, or where those points of contact, they're fixed in space. So push-ups, pull-ups, squats, deadlifts. And just like bilateral and unilateral training or exercises, you do want a combination of both, because there are benefits to both. But addressing specifically to the tactical personnel world, or the tactical world, you want to look majority of your time at the closed chain. This is going to address a lot of body weight movements, calisthenic type movements. And so closed chain is kind of one of those things, I personally would address and emphasize on, but there are huge benefits to implementing both into your training program.
Yeah, and like we were talking about before, that you want to think about your program in the week as a whole and everything that you have going into it. So with the closed chain movements in our program, we're going to oftentimes look at putting those on the higher end of it, because the energy toll that they take, and making sure that we have the ability to brace through some of those. So those oftentimes are going to be higher stress exercises. So we want to make sure that we have enough energy to perform those of quality. And then potentially with the open chain, those oftentimes are more structurally supported through a machine or points of contact. And so with those, we can look at adding those lower into our programming, because they're better supported. So we're not as dependent on our own stabilization to have to work through those. So it allows us to build a little bit more capacity through the muscles, and adding volume where we might not see that as much with the closed chain.
Exactly. And these two are just another way, when you're approaching or addressing your fitness program. And keep in mind, taking all of these into consideration, they don't have to be something where you have a piece of paper and you literally are checklisting and tally marking for days, right? It's just something to subconsciously take into consideration. With these two specifically, am I doing a lot of lying or machine work? Do I need to transfer over to some body weight, calisthenic, and movement pattern, or just movement type exercises? It's a way for you to, I guess, diversify or emphasize certain areas within your training program. So like I said, it's not something where you specifically have to write everything out. Okay, this is open chain, this is open chain, this is closed chain. It's just a way, this is a way for us to educate or inform you to become aware of your fitness program, to become aware of, why am I even doing these exercises? Because each exercise you do needs to have purpose, specifically for your line of work or your health. There needs to be some reason behind what you do. And so the more education or awareness you have behind exercise selection, the better the program for yourself and for your department. So that's as far as, kind of the intro to designing a fitness program. There's a lot more that goes into it behind programming, intensity, load, and different things like that. But this kind of gives you a starting point when constructing your fitness program. And so we're going to roll into kind of some questions that give you, food for thought, and we'll kind of go back and forth in regards to, our thought process behind these. And the first one being, is exercise selection important for tactical athletes? Why or why not? And we've covered this, throughout this presentation. It is definitely, not only is it important, it's vital for tactical athletes. I mean, what you're doing within training needs to carry over to in the field, and therefore we're preventing or managing injuries within the field. We're creating longevity and health for not only, while you're within the profession, but say you're a career firefighter and you, after you retire, you plan on doing, other things, or you specifically retire and you want to enjoy time with your grandkids or whatever it might be. The program should not only emphasize your job description of while you're within the profession, but also longevity for health. You want to not only survive your job, but you want life after your job. And so therefore exercise selection, movement selection is going to be vital for not only just specifically within the field, but longevity of health.
Yeah, and with exercise selection, as we've talked about, that having that in putting intention to it allows you to better consider where you're putting your time and energy, and if the priority of where that exercise should be in your program, or the importance of the transference of that. It also helps whenever you're looking at, like Hussien said, longevity. Instead of going in and not having a plan and just kind of doing exercise the day of, having an exercise selection and kind of putting a tier to those allows for better consideration of a structured program, and not just working out that it's less so from a workout of a day that we don't really have an ability to build upon that, because it's different each day. Whereas if we're working in a program, there's a structure and a format to it that we can continue to progress and see success on, and that's going to transfer over to all aspects of life.
The next question being, is training load always emphasized in each movement? Or do we always have to worry about what weight we're utilizing for each movement? Or does weight distribution play a factor? Now, definitely training load is not always vital. Yes, you need a new kind of stimulus to have some form of progression, right? Whether it be training intensity, whether it be how the weight is distributed in regards to center of gravity, center of mass, different, that kind of ties into the next question, but specifically looking at training load, it doesn't always have to be, what weight you use. An example of weight distribution, I guess, would be the difference between, a deadlift and then flipping a tire. Now, there are kind of different aspects in regards to tire flips. That is looked at more of a power movement, and the deadlifts, more seen as like a strength movement, right? But in that regards of weight distribution, the tire is bulkier. You're having to leverage differently. And honestly, in a more realistic scenario where you're moving debris, you're actually having to move something. And we all know, you might be able to lift something on deadlift, but depending on the tire or the side of that tire, just the way it's shaped, just the way the weight's distributed, you're gonna have a more difficult time moving the tire just based off of those factors alone, with a couple of others. But that's one example in regards to weight distribution.
And with the looking at load, so load is great if we're wanting to build overall strength, but it's also one of the easiest stimuluses that we can go to. So if we have an ability to put off adding load longer and longer, but still be able to adapt to our workouts and still be able to see progress, adding that load just adds to the stimulus so much quicker. So if we're looking at distance, time, and load, if we can impact through distance, if we can impact through time and save load for that last stimulus whenever we start running out or progressing far enough that we can better add load and then create a greater stimulus to boost that progress, we're going to see longer term success for that and our ability to just continue to progress. So what I mean by distance is we're looking at that weight distribution of different exercise. So think about if we're doing a front foot elevated lunge. So if our foot is up on a step or something like that, and we're lunging. So ipsilaterally, we have a dumbbell in our hand on the front foot elevated side. So if we're going through that lunge, instead of in our training block of week 1, week 2 through 4, instead of just adding weight every time, we might look at in a week to week progression or a block to block progression, maybe we take that weight from the side where we're most stabilized, and maybe we start bringing that out towards our knee. So now we've changed the weight distribution and we have gravity pulling down on that longer lever that's no longer by our center of mass and as supported. So now we're having to compensate for that extended dumbbell that's now out in front of us instead of supported by our other side. Speaking to distance as well, we can also look at taking that and now with our opposite hand going contralateral and kind of making a U shape around the movement pattern. And just through that, just through the weight distribution of the dumbbell, we've added adaptation to it without ever having to touch the weight. And so if we can continue to do that and build and then add the weight whenever we start running out on that, it's just going to give us a longevity to keep that movement, but continue to progress it and not just be limited by the weight that we're adding to it. Same thing with time. So time is us looking at the reps. So if we can get more efficient at our reps, let's say we're supposed to do 20 of the same movement, just to keep it simple, 20 of the same movement on each leg. So the first time you're doing it, where you look at maybe I can only do 5 on each leg. And that's how I have to break it up is 5 reps for 4 sets. And then if we continue with that, again, not touching load yet, not touching distance, but focusing on that time or the volume to it, we start building that capacity. So now that 5 turns into we're able to do 2 sets of 10. And then maybe we start adding to the volume. So we're looking at 30 and seeing how far we can take that volume or that time without touching the other 2. And so if we can break these down and be able to focus on them without just reliant on load, we can see a long progression without having to always depend on the resistance that we're trying to move and the inefficiency that might cause because the heavier loads that we're trying to overcome.
Awesome. And yeah, and taking or highlighting from that the aspect that you don't have to jump to training load every time. Like James said, that's the easiest thing to go to. Throwing more weight on the bar or using a heavier kettlebell. Finding different aspects that's going to change the intensity, change the stimulus that you're getting from each exercise. Moving on to the next question. Now, this kind of ties into the previous one, but just different aspects, I guess, of manipulation with your exercises. The next one being the surface area or point of contact change the intensity or focus. And definitely, changing the surface area that's covering that goes into with point of contact, more points of contact, more surface area, right? But surface area can be seen. I know, James, you've kind of played around with shoes or no shoes. And, that takes into consideration, not only do your shoes stabilize, your ankle and aspects in that regards, but, your shoe I would hope is going to be larger and cover more surface area than your foot. So therefore, you're having more contact with the ground. You're having more area that's stabilizing your movements. And I'm not saying go out and you have your entire department trained barefoot. I'm just saying that's a different aspect or an approach in regards to surface area. And then points of contact can be specifically looked at unilateral or bilateral. Doing a split squat where one leg is elevated, or I guess a pistol squat where you only have one point of contact. It could be where you're doing push-ups. Some people like to do single arm push-ups, 2 versus 1 points of contact. Doing a push-up and instead of both legs on the ground, you elevate one leg up and to where you have 3 instead of 2 points of contact. That's where we get the whole, I guess, how bird dogs work, right? You have 4 points of contact, one arm and one leg goes up, and now you have 2. And so this changes the intensity. It changes what muscles are being activated. It changes how you have to stabilize. It changes how, you're engaging your core. So therefore, it's going to raise the intensity, going from what, you go from more points of contact and decreasing that, you're going to raise the intensity, and you're kind of changing the focus. You're changing, you're focusing, with more points of contact, you can focus more on the strength aspect. And when you take away those points of contact or surface area that you're covering to stabilize, you're now focusing more on having to maintain that stability aspect. You're having to engage different muscles, stabilize, utilize different muscles. So therefore, you are changing your focus with that approach to manipulating your training.
Yeah, and to kind of reiterate, the less surface area that you have in your exercise, the more stabilization that's required and the greater intensity is going to be associated with that. So if we have a lot of things that are unsupported and we're having to stabilize a lot, we need to consider that in our program that, hey, maybe we have 1 or 2 exercises that are really focused on that. And then later on, whenever we're trying to build a little bit more volume, maybe we need to look at adding more points of contact or surface area to be more supported. So we're not just dumping stress upon stress in each exercise, that we're able to train through a little bit greater work capacity in some of these things. Guys are notorious for this of on the Smith machine or a chest press machine, that they can always go so much higher than an actual bench press, that whenever you go and do a bench press, that there's a realization that, hey, I was doing 200 plus pounds on this chest press and I can't do that on the bench press. Part of that is because there's more stabilization from the machines. And so you're able to work at a higher capacity than whenever you're reliant on your own stabilization of it. So looking at that, again, it's just another way or another way to evaluate your program and seeing where you're running stress through. That if your whole program is just you having to stabilize the whole time, you can run that for a while, but the ability for that to be sustainable in the long term is going to diminish. So if we can start looking at points of contact, of less points of contact maybe being earlier on in the program, and more points of contact being later on in the program when we're a little bit more fatigued. But because of that fatigue, we have more support externally.
Awesome. And then our last question, and this is associated directly in regards to injuries we've seen in the past. And I think I know for a fact with firefighting, and I think with law enforcement from I think it was a 2017, maybe 2015. With firefighters, it was a 2015 report that came out. And we're seeing specifically the 2 infield or fireground type injuries for fire, and I think this was definitely something highlighted in law enforcement. Is going to be overexertion, and then it was muscle strain, falls, trips, and slips. So those 3 are going to be huge incidents or injuries that we're seeing within first responders. And it differs within, what the profession is, what, in the field looks like as, or what the job description looks like is going to, factor that in is going to dictate kind of what the injuries look like. But that's what you're seeing the most. Now, how can you implement different factors to prevent those? Now, overexertion, it wasn't very defined within, I guess, the statistics that came behind firefighter injuries and law enforcement injuries, what overexertion specifically was. I feel like it was something where something external or internal, the workload or stressors were more than what the individuals could overcome in regards to work capacity, strength, or endurance, or something of that nature, right? They're being exerted past their capabilities. And so that, specifically looking in that regard, things you can implement just from a programming perspective is progression, building your work capacity. I mean, that's the premise, that's the purpose behind a strength and conditioning program is progression, being able to build your work capacity, your volume, being able to do more. So it depends on how you program out the progression of your training program, whether or not you're going to see those kinds of injuries. Sometimes it's inevitable, injuries happen, but we're trying to prevent them or decrease the possibility of that happening. Looking at overexertion, muscle strain. So training in different movement patterns, like we discussed, previously in the PowerPoint. There's different categories to address, to become aware of, that you need to be training in, because like we said earlier, you're only strong in the range of motion that you train in. You're only able to be efficient in movement patterns that you're doing, that you're replicating, that you're practicing, that you're doing in training, that's going to carry over to in the field. So to be able to, prevent or manage the likelihood of a muscle strain injury or some kind of musculature injury, prevent that or manage that, from happening, is going to be implementing different ranges of motion, different movement patterns, different planes of motion, different, categories that you're covering, bilateral, unilateral, different rotational, anti-rotational. Like everything we've covered is going to give you the building blocks for designing a fitness program to prevent that from happening, or manage the likelihood, decrease the possibility of that happening. And then I think the last one was fall, slips, and trips. Same concept. One of the categories was transition, from ground to stance or stance to ground. And so, if you're you see, whether it's on a movie or you've seen it happen, where someone trips and they're able to catch themselves, and it's a reaction, it's a reactive type instinct. But on top of that, when you catch yourself, you have to have, not only strong muscles, but strong ligaments and tendons that are able to adapt or absorb that force, whether you're falling or jump or do a different kind of bound. So doing different kind of plyometrics, but not just plyometrics. You can do unilateral movements, single limb balance and stabilization type movements, where you're strengthening those areas. That's going to decrease the likelihood or decrease the possibility of injury.
Yeah, and to build off the last one of the trips and falls, that some of these things just on the job are unavoidable. But with considerations to this training, we're trying to minimize that the best we can, because it is all about reaction time and our ability to recover. So when we're looking back at some of the tenets of the things we talked about today, if you have anti-rotation, if you're able to stabilize, you're more efficient with your body positioning. And so there's a greater likelihood for you to be able to react sooner to some of those trips, falls, stumbles, and recover quicker. There's also something to be said whenever you're training through different movement patterns, you have a greater awareness of how your body moves in space. And so if you understand how your body's moving in space, it gives you a greater ability to be able to adapt to the situation, to try to catch yourself, or when or if you fall, that you can absorb that force more efficiently. And it goes from potentially injuring yourself or like breaking a bone to being able to move slightly in that time from the trip to the ground contact, that you understand how your body moves in space and you're able to adapt even slightly for that. It could be the difference from a broken bone to just a bump and a scratch. Um, so yeah, I think this is with all of those that, again, some are completely unavoidable, but with considerations to your training program and trying to be more intentional around these things, there's a greater ability to reduce the likelihood of some of these happening.
Awesome. And, that's all the questions we had. If you do have any other questions, any comments, concerns, anything you would like for us to cover, definitely reach out. You can send an email to jabaiperformance@gmail.com. You can check out this webinar or any of the other webinars at jabaiperformance.live. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, all that good stuff. Send us any questions, comments, and we'll get back to you, as soon as we can. If we can make a video covering the topic, that's even better. Basically, we're doing this off of what we would like to address or inform within the tactical world, tactical profession and professionals. But, if there's something specifically that, there's either a gap in education, something you would like to address or emphasize or gather more details on. Maybe, some of this we covered was, kind of like a review, but maybe there are a couple of concepts that you had some questions on that we could kind of dig a bit deeper. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And James, I appreciate you coming on and talking a bit.
I appreciate you having me.